Okay, so it's good to see everybody. I was saying a couple of moments ago that we should have class outside today because it's a beautiful spring day. But thanks to Jan for having her background there so that we could see what it's like outside today. Our Torah reading this week is the portion Shemini in the Eitz Chaim. It's on page 630. Whatever edition of Chumash you're using, you want to turn to the book of Leviticus. Again, the portion Shemini, Leviticus chapter 9. So the blessing for Torah study, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So Shemini means eighth. Shmoneh is the number 8. Shemini is eighth. So what is that? The cardinal number or the ordinal number? Whatever way it is. This is the 8th day of the consecration ceremony. So there were 7 days that the priests were consecrated. We read about some of that at the end of the book of Exodus in terms of how Aaron and his sons were undergoing this consecration ceremony. And then the book of Leviticus began with a description of the variety of sacrifices that were to be offered. And now chapter 9, after all those sacrifices are described, now we get to the 8th day. It's one of the few moments in the book of Leviticus in which there is actually narrative. Most of the book of Leviticus is descriptive of laws surrounding sacrifices and purity, kashrut, which is in this portion as well, and things like that, as opposed to very small segments like the beginning here on 630, the beginning of chapter 10, which we'll get to momentarily, about 2 of Aaron's 4 sons and what happens to them. So very, very small sections are actually narrative. This is what happens on the 8th day. Vayihi bayom hashmini, and on the 8th day, kara Moshe li'Aharon ulevanav uleziknei Yisrael. Moses called out to Aaron and his sons and to the elders of Israel. Vayomer el Aharon, he said to Aaron, Kach lecha, take an egel ben bakar, a calf of the herd, lechata'at, for a sin offering, va'ayol le'olah, and a ram for a burnt offering, tamimim, pure, without blemish, v'hakrev lifnei Adonai, and offer it or get close, because the word for offering here, korban, is a sacrifice, but it comes from the same root as karov, meaning to get close. So the idea behind a korban, a sacrifice, is it's the mechanism by which we get closer to God. Okay, so we could understand that prayer, which is the substitute for sacrifice and offerings today, serve the same purpose. We recite words, we recite the prayers in order to get closer to God. These sacrifices help us get closer to God. So hakrev lifnei Adonai could mean get closer to God, or offer the ram and the calf to God. Verse 3, Ve'el b'nei Yisrael tedaber lemor, and to the people of Israel you should speak, saying, Kechu seir izim lechata'at, take a he-goat for a sin offering, ve'egel v'cheves ben shana, and a calf and a lamb 1 year old, tamimim, without blemish, la'olah, as a burnt offering. V'shor va'ayol lishlamim, an ox and a ram for a peace offering or a well-being offering, lizboach lifnei Adonai, to slaughter before God, umincha belulav hashamen, and a grain offering with oil mixed in, Ki hayom Adonai nir'a alechem, because today, this 8th day, God will be seen before you. Okay, so they did what Moses commanded. And then there's a comment on verse 7. Verse 7 says, Vayomer Moshe el Aharon. Moses said to Aaron, Krav el hamizbeach, approach the altar. Ve'aseh et chatatcha ve'et olatecha, and do your sin offering and burnt offering. Ve'chaper ba'adcha, and atone for you. Uva'ad ha'am, and atone for the people. Ve'aseh et korban ha'am, and do the sacrifice of the people. Ve'chaper ba'adam, and atone for them. Ka'asher tziva Adonai, as God commanded. So the question here is, he already told in verse 2, Moses already told Aaron to approach God, to take these animals and approach God. Why is Moses saying it again in verse 7? So down below the line on 631, we have this. Moses said to Aaron, come forward. So I translated it as approach. But this translation says come forward, same thing. There is a tradition that Aaron had to be urged to bring his purification offering, a calf, because he was embarrassed, right? So he's commanded to bring an egel, a calf, and perhaps he has to be encouraged to approach the altar because he's embarrassed. What's he embarrassed about? It reminded him of his role in fashioning the golden calf, Egel Hazahav, the golden calf. Moses, however, assured him, your sin has been forgiven because you were ashamed, right? So this idea that Aaron was hesitating, and then the text says that Moses is encouraging Aaron to go forward, to approach, that reflected his hesitancy because of his role in the golden calf, which we had just read about a few chapters ago in the book of Exodus. So the Menorat HaMaor, one of the commentaries, suggests that because of Aaron's regret and caused him to hesitate to bring the sacrifice. Maybe he's thinking he's not worthy. So then our commentary goes on. The ability to feel shame is one of the defining characteristics of a moral human being. It arises from an awareness of the gap between who we are and who we might be. Furthermore, it recognizes the authority of God and the right of other people to judge us. Right, so shame is an important characteristic for a moral religious person. It allows us to ask forgiveness, to be in a position to have the mindset to ask for forgiveness and to try to be a better person. So without shame or humility, we would just be arrogant, and that has no place in a religious society. Okay, there is, yes, just a second, right. Now, the main event of this portion, just letting somebody else in. The main event of this portion is the beginning of chapter 10, which serves as a very disturbing section because it highlights something about the Torah's understanding of God's role in our lives and questioning God's actions. So let's read the beginning. It's the very bottom of page 632, the very start of chapter 10. Vayikhu v'nei Aharon, the sons of Aaron took. Which sons of Aaron? Nadav and Avihu. He has two other sons, Eleazar and Itamar. So the four sons of Aaron are Eleazar, Itamar, Nadav, and Avihu. Okay, so the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, took ish machtato, each one their fire pan. So the order of the words is unusual. They took, the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, each one his fire pan. So it would have been better to say, Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, each one of them took his fire pan, vayitnu vahen esh, and they put in them fire. So what does that mean, to put fire in a fire pan? Do they put coals in the fire pan? What is it? Something already burning do they put in the fire pan? It's unclear what they put in it, but they put something burning in their fire pan. Vayasimu aleha ketoret, and then they put on that burning thing incense. Vayakrivu lifnei Adonai, and they offered it before God. Eish zara, strange fire. Now, is what they put in the fire pan the strange fire? Or did they also offer something additional, which was strange fire? So it's ambiguous. Was what they were just doing with their fire pan strange fire? Or did they add strange fire to their fire pan? Asher lo tziva otam, which they put, so they offered before God strange fire, which was not commanded of them. So they were being spontaneous with the ritual. They were offering something that was not commanded of them. Was it treif? I'm using a kashrut terminology here for this process of offering the incense offering in the Mishkan. Were they doing something that was totally wrong, or were they offering something at a time that wasn't commanded? In other words, was somebody praying the afternoon service instead of praying the morning service? So that there's nothing wrong with praying the afternoon service. The liturgy is there. You're just doing it at the wrong time. Was that the bad thing? Were they offering incense, which was still kosher to offer, but were they offering it at a bad time? Or were they offering incense that was totally made up and a formula that was not prescribed at all? So that we don't know. Verse 2, so whatever they did was wrong or inappropriate. It's unclear whether it was sinful. So vateitze eish milifnei Adonai, fire erupted from before God, vatochal otam, and it ate them. I'm translating literally, obviously. The fire consumed them, vayamutu lifnei Adonai, and they died before God. Vayomer Moshe el Aharon, verse 3, Moses said to Aaron, Asher diber Adonai lemor, Moses said to Aaron what God said to him, saying, Bikrovai ekadesh, I will be sanctified among those close to me. Okay, so the English says, through those near to me, I show myself holy. I'm translating it more literally. I will become sanctified among those close to me. How is God being sanctified? By consuming Nadav and Avihu. That's how God is being sanctified. That's what it seems here. I will be sanctified from those who come close to me. Va'al panei chol ha'am ekaved, and in front of the entire people, I will be glorified. Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. So clearly, this is a difficult section. Why? It's difficult, it's challenging, it's almost unacceptable. How could, because clearly from the Torah, okay, Nadav and Avihu died. That seems to be what happened. How they died is the question. For the Torah, it's not a question. It seems from the Torah's perspective, Nadav and Avihu died because God killed them. A fire erupted from before God and consumed them. Now, it could be, very simply, imagine lighting a barbecue grill and using a charcoal lighter for your charcoal. Now, I don't do this. I buy already soaked charcoal, so you just have to put a match on it. But there is charcoal that you need to soak with charcoal lighter, right? This can of fluid that you spray onto the charcoal. Now, of course, you're supposed to do that ahead of time, soak it, put that can far away, and then put the match to the charcoal. Imagine, though, if you lit the match while you're spraying the charcoal lighter. Do not do that, because if you did that, the fire could follow the stream into the can, and the can could explode. Now, it's possible that Nadav and Avihu did something like that with their fire pan. That it's quite possible that because this is the first time they're doing it, it's still on this 8th day. It seems to be that way. They haven't been doing the incense yet. They've just been having the consecration ceremony. So maybe they did something wrong with their fire pan that caused a sudden eruption of fire and killed them. However, the Torah, so it could be purely an accident, but according to the Torah, it's understood that God killed them. Okay? So the question then is, why does the Torah have this perspective that God killed them? What did they do so wrong to warrant being killed by God? In other words, if we were to compare what their father did with the golden calf and what they did here with the fire pan, there'd be no question in my mind, just from reading the text itself, that what Aaron, their father, did with the golden calf is a more grievous sin than what Nadav and Avihu did. Aaron fashioned an idol, and he wasn't killed by God for doing it. Nadav and Avihu were just offering strange incense. It doesn't say it was idolatrous for them to do it. It just says it was strange. Now, idolatry is known as avodah zarah, strange worship, the same word for eish zarah here. So it's possible that the fire that they're offering could have been considered idolatrous fire, but we don't know. We don't know for sure. All we know is that what their punishment, clearly the Torah says that they were punished, and they were punished by God erupting with fire and consuming them on the spot. So for this very challenging section here, the Haftarah, by the way, for this section has another similar challenging section from the book of Samuel, describing David capturing the ark from the Philistines, like recapturing the ark from the Philistines, bringing it back to Jerusalem. On the way back to Jerusalem, somebody Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark on the wagon, and Uzzah was not supposed to do that. Only the Levites are allowed to touch it, and Uzzah was not among those who were allowed to touch it as it was faltering on the cart. He goes to steady it, and God strikes him down on the spot and kills him. Okay, so the Haftarah takes a similar event, an unexplained tragic death, because how dare anyone approach in a way that they're not supposed to approach, whether it's Nadav and Avihu or Uzzah. And this is how we are supposed to, we the reader are left baffled as to how to explain the unexplainable event as God desiring the death of these people for daring to do something not commanded. Okay, what kind of God does this inspire belief in? Does this inspire belief? Is it worth it to believe in a God of which we are afraid of? And let me just add something else. It's interesting that tonight is Yom HaShoah, and that we read the portion Shemini on the week in which we observe Yom HaShoah, because the death of the 6 million could also be understood in this way. I have to mute myself for a second because someone's calling me. Sorry about that. So for posterity, that was my son calling. He has off from school today. He doesn't have class on Wednesday. So what is he doing? He's going to the doubleheader at Nats Park today. He's supposed to be a Phillies fan, not a Nats fan, but okay. Now let's get back into this, and I'm sorry for the interruption there. The question of no, not the question. The coincidence that we read the portion Shemini which has this theologically challenging event with the Yom HaShoah, which is also theologically challenging, because if we approach God in a traditional Jewish way, the traditional Jewish understanding is God determines the course of human events. So that's clear from the Torah that that's what God does. And it's clear for the rabbis in their interpretation of the Torah and developing Judaism as we know it, that God does that. Okay, so that God's role in the universe is to determine the course of human events and the course of world events. So anything that happens in nature, God causes that to happen too. Okay? Anything that happens in nature, God causes. Anything that people choose to do, God causes them to do it. The only sense of control that we have over our lives is through teshuvah, through repentance. That if we pray fervently for God to listen to us, and we are worthy of, because of our actions, of God listening to us, then perhaps we can avert what God had planned to happen to us. Okay? So, which raises huge theological challenges in terms of why would God choose to murder or to have the Nazis murder 6 million innocent Jews? And now, the only response for a traditional Jew is now, there are two responses. The first is, if something happens to us, we deserved it to happen. And if that doesn't satisfy us, right, in other words, that there's no clear correlation between our grievous, sinful action and the punishment from God that happens right after that, if there's no correlation, then the only other explanation is it's a mystery. Who are we to question God's ways? Okay, so that when Aaron is silent at the end of verse 3, Vayidom Aharon, that is understood as Aaron just accepting God's will. Now, for the Holocaust, for survivors of the Holocaust, for family members of those who survived the Holocaust, or for those who were murdered in the Holocaust, that traditional Jewish response is often not satisfactory. And so many Jews after the Holocaust gave up on their Judaism or their traditional Jewish identity because of the how do you believe in God who would have caused the Holocaust to happen? And it's not enough to suggest that 3 years later the state of Israel was established as compensation for the 6 million. That is just for some, that is heresy, blasphemy to suggest that, right? So there are tremendous theological challenges to this, what happened to Nadav and Avihu in our portion this morning, and to the Holocaust, okay, which will then requires moderns to derive different theological constructs to allow us to still be traditional Jews with an untraditional understanding of God. Okay, so over the years, I have spoken about my theology, certainly on the second day of Rosh Hashanah in relation to the Abraham and Isaac and binding of Isaac story, and at other times over my nearly 27 years with the congregation, just explaining my theology and allowing it. And I'll just throw out Abraham Joshua Heschel as an approach, Harold Kushner, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, as an approach, Neil Gilman, a theologian, philosopher from the seminary who wrote books about Jewish theology, one of them right behind me. This book, Sacred Fragments, in which he describes a whole variety of Jewish theologies to try to understand, right? The subtitle is Recovering Theology for the Modern Jew. So I highly recommend this book to try to get a really good understanding, and it's not written for doctorates of philosophy. It's written for the average person. So it's a very good book. It's also in paperback, but of course it's also on Kindle. However you read your books. That's a great introduction to modern Jewish theology. So highly recommend that. So, and then there's a newer book edited by my colleague, Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove of the Park Avenue Synagogue. And I am looking for that quickly on my shelf, and I don't no, I don't see it right away on my shelf, but so if you just Google Elliot Cosgrove, Cosgrove, it's even newer than the Sacred Fragments. Sacred Fragments is already 30 years old, but theology is an ancient thing. So it's not like it's outdated. It's just that Elliot Cosgrove just has a newer edition of different understandings of God. Okay, so I just want to bring all of that out about how challenging this section is and how we try to understand events as they happen today. And if we are religious people, then we naturally understand these events from a religious perspective. And I always say it's a lot easier when something good happens to us to ascribe that good thing to God causing it to happen, right? So if we're in the room when our child is born, if we're under the chuppah getting married, if we are celebrating our child's bar or bat mitzvah, it's easy to say, thank God for this happening in my life, right? No, it's an easy thing to do because it's a wonderful thing happening. But the opposite, if you're, God forbid, attending a funeral of a loved one, or you're in the hospital visiting somebody who is sick, it's challenging, if not impossible, to say, thank God I am here doing this, right? That seems not just wrong, but bizarre and just not the right thing to do. But for the rabbis who developed this theology based on how the Torah is presenting it, it's exactly the same thing. If we can thank God for the good things in our life, we have to thank God for the bad things that happen in our life, and we have to accept the bad with the good. And that's what the book of Job is all about, right? So just read the book of Job, and that's in the Bible. Trying to understand, Job is trying to make sense of this theology, and essentially the book ends with God lecturing Job. Who are you? Do you know when the animals are going to be giving birth? Do you know when the seasons are going to change? Who are you to question me? God says to Job. And Job says, okay, you're right. And then at the end, Job is restored with all from all the bad things that had happened to him at the beginning of the book. Okay, so here is an attempt at trying to make sense of this perspective. So let's look below the line here on 633 and see what our commentary has to say about it too. So the Torah narrates the death of Nadav and Avihu very briefly, never telling us explicitly what they did to cause them to be struck down. Okay, so there's a lot of midrash that tries to explain Nadav and Avihu's motivation, because there is no motivation for them bringing this strange fire. Okay, so the rabbis will, and the commentary will go on to give some of it, but I'm just wanted to provide some context here for the rabbis in the midrash to try to explain that who Nadav and Avihu are and what their motivation was for doing this, that would then warrant them being struck down. So therefore, commentators over the generations have used their imaginations to speculate about what grave sin they might have committed. One explanation is that they brought the instruments for making a fire into the tent, not realizing that on this special occasion, God was going to send fire miraculously from heaven, right? So in other words, they thought they were doing the right thing by providing all the tools for making a fire, when they should have known that God is going to make the fire appear miraculously. Because they were too close to that fire, they were killed. Okay, so it's kind of like my explanation of they brought the charcoal lighter into the Mishkan when they shouldn't have, and the fire was already there, so it became explosive, and they were killed purely by accident, and they should have known better. Okay, so their sin, if any, was a lack of faith, trying to help God in a situation in which God did not need their help. Okay, so their lack of faith then caused them to be struck down. So that's perspective number one, or explanation number one. Most of the sages, however, judge them less charitably. Okay, so in other words, there's nothing that Nadav and Avihu did wrong. They thought that they needed to bring this at that time, and they thought, well, let me say it this way. It's a funny thing that the rabbis at the same time will say, never rely on a miracle. if you're in a difficult situation, don't say God's going to provide. There'll be a miracle and I'll be saved. So the rabbis say this a few times throughout the Talmud and other places in rabbinic literature. You never rely on a miracle. You're supposed to fend for yourself and do the best thing for yourself. So in other words, to be a Jehovah's Witness or a Christian Scientist when it comes to taking care of our bodies is not a Jewish thing. So we have to partner with God, like researching a vaccine, getting a vaccine administered to us. Those are definitely Jewish things to do. We need to partner with God. So we can't rely on God. You're going to make me better, and I'll take my chances with getting COVID-19. And if God wants me to get it, then I'll get it. And if God doesn't want me to get it, I won't get it. That is entirely a wrong and not a Jewish attitude to have. Absolutely not. God asks, it's understood that we need to partner with God for healing, that to become a doctor is a Jewish thing to do in order to partner with God to make the world better and bring healing to the world. Okay, so so when the Midrash says here that their sin, if any, was a lack of faith, trying to help God in a situation which God did not need their help, how are we supposed to know when God needs our help or not? Okay, so that's another. That raises more questions than it answers by providing this midrash here. Most of the sages, however, judge them less charitably. Some find them guilty of egotism because each took his own fire pan, consulting neither with each other nor with their father Aaron. Okay, right? Each was doing it on their own, or of entering the sanctuary drunk, for which reason priests are told in verse 9 not to drink wine before entering the sanctuary, right? That's the next commandment that is commanded to Aaron and his remaining sons and other Kohanim, not to be intoxicated in performing their service. So some of the rabbis suggest maybe Nadav and Avihu were intoxicated, which is why, right? So the rabbis often do that. Right, the classic midrash is about this well that miraculously followed the Israelites through the desert. And how do we know that? Because Miriam, Moses' sister, dies, and the very next thing the Torah describes is that the people were thirsty. Okay, and so there's the classic example of the rabbis taking two stories that are seemingly not connected, and they're right next to each other, and the rabbis connecting them by suggesting then that Miriam, because she was a prophetess in her own right, provided blessing to the entire people of Israel by having this miracle of a well of water following the people through their travels in a desert. And when she died, the well dried up, and that's why the people were thirsty. So here, Nadav and Avihu die at God's hand. Aaron is silent. Nadav and Avihu's cousins, Elzavan and Uziel, take care of the body. And then the very next thing that we read about is the commandment for Kohanim not to be intoxicated. So that's why the rabbis suggest, Nadav and Avihu must have been intoxicated. Okay. Or they may have entered so casually dressed that they showed disrespect for their surroundings. Maybe they weren't dressed in the way they were supposed to be dressed on this 8th day in offering these sacrifices. Okay, so either they are egotistical, or they were drunk, or they were casually dressed. Others accuse them of impatience to succeed Moses and Aaron as leaders of the people. The strange fire they bore was the fire of ambition, which prompted them to say, when will these old men, our father and our uncle, right? Father Aaron, uncle Moses, when will they die already so that we can take their place? Right? So that's the classic one that we might be most familiar with, that midrash, that the Eish Zara, the strange fire, was this fire of ambition, and they're talking amongst themselves. When, because at this point, Moses is 80 years old, he's 80 years old at this point. He was 80 at the time of the Exodus, and this is just a couple months later, and Aaron's 83. So when are they going to die already? The Midrash says Nadav and Avihu are saying, so we can take it. So us young, the mantle of leadership can come to us younger folk. Based on the comment of the Sifra, another collection of rabbinic commentary, that their sin was not consulting with their father, Hirsch, champion of modern orthodoxy, identifies their sin as making themselves the highest authority and disregarding the tradition of their elders, right? So they took matters in their own hand, or they were creative in the ritual as opposed to consulting with tradition. One intriguing interpretation sees them as motivated by excessive piety. Out of their love for the divine, they tried to come too close to God, who is like a raging fire. So now this is a totally opposite perspective. So either they lacked faith, or they were egotistical, or they were drunk, or they were arrogant and ambitious, all on the negative side, or they were overly good. They were overly pious. And because they were overly pious, they got too close to God's fire, and that burned them up. They were motivated by a passion for closeness to God that God did not command because it was too dangerous. Nadav, here it says in parentheses, means willing, right? A nedava is a donation or a gift. And Avihu means God is my father, or it means he is my father, and the he being God. God is my father. So they could not be satisfied with rituals and sacrifices, but had to draw so close to God that they were consumed by the strange fire in their souls. Okay, so they were extremely pious, extremely saintly, extremely mystical. And this excessive mysticism on their part caused them to get too close to God's fire. Or perhaps Aaron is warned so often and so sternly about when and how to enter the tabernacle, lest he too be struck down in his desire to be one with God. Okay, so this takes a different approach to understanding Nadav and Avihu. Okay, and now it concludes. So either all these bad things about Nadav and Avihu's personality, or this one positive, over saintly understanding, an over mystical understanding of them, or a homiletic interpretation fastens on the rabbinic legend in the Talmud that the fire consumed their souls, but left their bodies intact. Thus, they could be removed from the sight by dragging them by their garments in verse 5, right? So we didn't read that, but in verse 5, they came forward and carried them out of the camp by their tunics as Moses had ordered. So if the fire consumed them, what does that consumption look like? So, because if the fire consumed them, they would be ashes. How do you pull them out by their ashes? Then that leads the Midrash to suggest they were consumed from the inside out. So their souls were consumed and died, but their bodies remained intact. It suggests that their fate was to suffer a spiritual death in their lifetime. So they didn't really die. They just spiritually died. And when Eltzaphan and Uziel came in to take them out, they're taking out these spiritually dead, living people. So they could no longer function in their role as Kohanim. They had to leave and be isolated, but they're not dead. They're not physically dead. So that's an interesting understanding. In direct contrast to the previous interpretation, it sees them as no longer feeling reverence or holiness in carrying out their sacred tasks. They were emotionally burned out Their souls had shriveled even as they continued to go through the motions of religious ritual. So the only problem with this is, how can you be emotionally burned out only 8 days after you start working? Right? So the Mishkan is built. They have 7 days of a consecration ceremony, and on the 8th day, they're emotionally burned out already. Okay, now if they were these spiritually, mystically elevated kind of people, perhaps then doing the same thing in this intense mystical experience for 7 days in a row, that could burn them out. That is possible. That is possible, and they just can't do it anymore. They can't see doing their job any less than how they needed to do it, and because of that, they were spiritually burned out. So that's an interesting way to understand this section. It takes away some of the graphic, harsh sense of what the text seems to be saying, and it takes all the theology, the questions of theology away, and it focuses instead on how we approach the religious mitzvot that we perform. And if we were to perform them very seriously, like the rabbis say in the Talmud, the Hasidim, and these aren't the black coat, black hat people in the time of the rabbis 1800 years ago, they didn't exist. These are just the extra pious. When it was time for the morning service, they would get to shul an hour early to prepare to daven. Then they would daven, and then they would stay an extra hour after davening to debrief from their davening. So the Hasidim would do that. And it becomes difficult then to maintain such a high level of piety and saintliness in your life that it makes it difficult to live in the real world. The real world is not saintly and holy in that way. So we have to manage to navigate the desire to be mystical and saintly in a world that is chaotic. And perhaps then what we learn from this section, this last paragraph of the commentary teaches us, is that if you are too saintly and mystical, then you can't survive in this world. And if you are too much of an anarchist and irreligious, you can't survive in the world either. You have to find a golden mean. That's Maimonides, Rambam taught that the ideal Jewish way is to find a balance between the chaos and the saintly, the chaos and the holy. Because if you go too much to either side, we will not be able to survive. Yes, Rita, unmute yourself. Unmute. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, on the eve of Yom HaShoah, I still can't accept the fact of what happened to 6 million people, especially 1.5 million children
right,
who had not committed any sins whatsoever.
Right.
My mother, who came from a very pious home, my grandfather, Olav Shalom, he gave to tzedakah. He was very learned, and
right.
There wasn't a bad bone in his body.
Yeah.
She could not accept. She no longer was a Shomeret Shabbat when we came here, because she was widowed in her 20s. She lost her parents, brothers and sisters. Only one of them survived, and so I have difficulty with it too.
Yep.
And I'm often asked by students when I do speak about my experiences, how come you still believe in God? I said, well, I think it was evil people doing bad things to other people. It was not God.
Right.
I mean, he created us in his image, but some of us are not very good. We're horrible. We have the Yetzer Hara taking over.
Right.
And
I absolutely agree with you, Rita. And ever since I applied to rabbinical school, one of the process of the application was to provide short essay answers to different questions, and one was, "What is your theology?" So from that moment on, and that's so what I was 22 years old when I applied to rabbinical school, just a baby. And what do I know from theology? I was a rabbi's son, going to shul all the time, reading Torah every Shabbos, and doing all of these Jewish things. So I didn't bother thinking about theology. My life was relatively good. I didn't have any experience of needing of questioning God. So my looking at those at that answer, it's a little bit embarrassing for the how childish that perspective of God there is. But I recognize there that with the Holocaust, the question of the traditional understanding of God is challenging, if not impossible, to accept. So that's why I have developed, and it's not me, it's based on Kushner, Heschel, and other modern Jewish thinkers like them, who suggest, right, so you have to balance the traditional idea. God is all powerful and all knowing, right? That's the traditional idea, with an understanding of why bad things happen, and to how to believe in a God in a world where bad things happen. Okay, and we take the extreme, because it's Yom HaShoah tonight. We take the extreme of the 6 million, 1.5 million children. How do you believe in a God in a world in which a Holocaust could happen? So the God I believe in is what you say, Rita, is a God that created this whole process with imperfections. And God did so purposefully to create a world with imperfections so that we can have the experience of working in partnership with God to make the world better. And we see from our own experience what happens if we don't take our job seriously, right? We had the chance to stop Hitler. World leaders had a chance to stop Hitler. But what did Neville Chamberlain say when he reached a so-called agreement with Hitler about Czechoslovakia? We've achieved peace in our day, right? And that was in 1939, right? Ridiculous. So Roosevelt knew and had the opportunity to bomb the train tracks in Germany, to stop the trains going to the concentration camps, and decided not to do it, right? So decisions were made. The Evian conference to decide. They had the opportunity to save the Jews of Europe. And what? The Dominican Republic was the only country that would allow Jews in. And right, this St. Louis hovering over, right, off the shore of Florida, and then in Cuba, and then had to go back to Europe, where many of them ended up dying in the right. So this is the extreme example of human beings making the wrong decision and deciding not to stop evil, seeing evil and not stopping it, and then seeing the horrific consequence of not stopping evil when we had the chance to do it, right? And we haven't learned our lesson. Right, you just look in the 90s, the early 90s, with the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. 1.5 million people massacred there. It happens at what the Chinese are doing to the Muslim minority in Western China, putting them in concentration camps, forcing them to become Chinese. Right, what the Rohingya refugees in Myanmar. Okay, Tragically, there are still examples of evil in the world today.
Oh, yeah.
And so, the point of the Holocaust Museum, the United States Holocaust Museum, one of the points of it is to teach, to be an example of this is what happens when we let evil run its course. And we should learn from this so that we don't let evil run its course anymore. And we haven't learned our lesson. So, yeah, so the question, we got 5 minutes left, and it's, the question is, how do you still, so is it worth believing in a God that is seemingly not all powerful and all knowing, right? In other words, if the Torah and the rabbis teach that God can perform miracles, and sometimes we pray for miracles to happen, but at the same time we have to partner with God and not rely on miracles. So then why didn't God intervene and stop the Holocaust from happening, right? So that just leaves us challenged, and there's no good answer to that. So I still believe in God, despite the evil that's in the world, the evil that's in humanity, and the chaos of the world, of the natural world around us, like COVID-19 happening. I still believe in God because I need God. I need the belief in God to guide me to do the right thing.
All right.
To learn how to be a moral and ethical person, and believing in God in a Jewish way. I'm not saying that Jewish way is the only way to believe in God. So a devout Christian, Muslim, Hindu, they all believe that a religious belief in God provides rituals and actions to do that will elevate our lives and provide us a taste of what a spiritual world will look like. And so for me, to do the Jewish things that I do, they are opportunities to escape the chaos of the world and to imagine a world that is better. And if everybody, so you don't necessarily need a belief in God in order to be a better person. If everyone in the world were at least moral and ethical, then the world would be a much better place. I believe that God, a belief in God, a Jewish belief in God, elevates my life and provides grounding for me. So, so Rita, I can't, you as a survivor of the Holocaust have more right to talk about this than I do, because you lived it, and you were running during it for your life. So I can only be in awe of you marrying Nathan after the war, raising 3 beautiful children, becoming a devoted member of Sharei Tefillah, and such a good Jew and a good role model. It's incredible. And I have no idea what would have happened, what I would have done if I were in your shoes, and what kind of person I would have been if I had survived the Holocaust. I have no idea. And I am in awe of you and your fellow survivors who managed, despite what you witnessed and the death that you experienced, to still emerge as a good person and someone who contributes in a positive way to society. So that's just incredible for me to know your story and to know the stories of other survivors like you. It's just, yeah. So with that, I think that's a good way to end our class today.
Thank you. I still say Ani Mami.
Yeah, right. Which is incredible. And it's because you say Ani Ma'amin, we should say Ani Ma'amin as well. If you can believe, then we certainly can believe. So with that, have a good day, everybody. Stay safe and healthy. and have a meaningful Yom HaShoah experience tonight and tomorrow.
Light a candle tonight.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.